Okay, Erev Tov, everybody. Parashat Tetzaveh. I did something a little different than usual this time in taking two separate excerpts. It's a quite an interconnected set of essays and comments by Dr. Aviva Zornberg, and it's hard to pull out a few sections, but there were a couple that really spoke to me, so I selected them, and I will start off by reading to you a midrash that she refers to at the very beginning of our section, so that we have that in our minds for our learning. She notes in the very beginning section one of the often discussed dimensions of Parashat Tetzaveh, which is the omission of Moshe's name and the direct address to him in the second person. V'ata Tetzaveh, as for you, you should command the children of Israel, and that there are a couple more times throughout the Parashah where this unusual form V'ata recurs, and in particular, as she writes towards the beginning, in all three cases, paradoxically, these are in the first 5 psukim, in all three cases, paradoxically, Moshe is to assume a direct responsibility in an area that is specifically not his own, having to do with tending the menorah, which will really belong to Aaron, the high priest, etc. And she writes, therefore, attention accumulates around God's address to Moses. Implicitly, enigmatically, it is Moses who represents the dynamic out of which the priestly function takes its vital force. And she puts this in the larger context of the idea that Moshe's name is never mentioned in this week's parasha, and why that might be the case. It's almost always, and indeed this week, read during the week in which the date of Moshe's birth and death, the 7th of Adar, which it is now, occur. And so we have this sort of sense of Moshe being present and absent at the same time. And she writes, then birth and death, gain and loss are figured in the reassuring intonation of Ve'ata, and as for you, in a context where his name is absent and Aaron's name dominates. Aaron's name indeed occurs 7 times within this passage, from chapter 27, verse 20 to chapter 28. Verse 5. So we have this play between Moshe and Aaron, Moshe's being the figure who's being addressed and the one who's sort of giving birth almost to the kahuna, but the kahuna is not his, it's Aaron's. And she continues, the subliminal tension in the relationship of Moshe and Aaron is the subject of a penetrating midrash. And I will read you that midrash in translation. It's a midrash from Shemot Rabbah on our section, and here's what it says. And as for you, you shall bring forward your brother Aharon, the beginning of the second of the chapters of this week's parasha, which talk about the inauguration of the Kohen Gadol, Aharon. And the Midrash says, it is written, if your Torah had not been my plaything, I should have perished in my poverty. When God told Moses, as for you, you should bring forward your brother Aharon, God did Moshe an injury. God said, I had possession of the Torah and I gave it to you. If it were not for the Torah, I should have lost my world. This is like a wise man who married his relative, and after 10 years together, when she had not borne children, he said to her, seek me a wife. He said to her, I could marry without your permission, but I seek your cooperation. That he is the same he, speaking both times in succession. So God said to Moshe, I could have made your brother high priest without informing you, but I wish you to be great over him. Okay, so God is telling Moshe to appoint Aaron as high priest, and the Midrash is telling us that's like a husband telling their wife to look for another more fertile wife for them. That's the context out of which she talks about this tension in the relationship between Moshe and Aaron, and delves a little bit into each of their personalities. And from that starting point, we're going to try to delve into our excerpts. Here we go. This is page 361 at the bottom. Loss and gain, Aharon's garments and the ambiguities of representation. Power and forbearance, the priestly robes. It's actually quite striking that the Midrash, which is about to be quoted here about greatness and humility coexisting, is the Midrash which Rav Avi quoted this morning in his eulogy for Joan Solomon of blessed memory. So we come back to it again. We return to our original Midrash, in which Moshe's appointment of his brother as high priest is compared to a wife's quest for a rival wife. Here, the axis of humility and greatness is central. God demands of Moshe a compliance, a forbearance in his own diminishment, that is then translated as be great over him, right? That was the kind of punchline of the Midrash, right? So God is telling Moshe, diminish yourself and go seek this alternative partner for me in Aharon, who's going to serve as the high priest essentially in your stead, in whatever way you couldn't do it, you're not going to do it, and you have to find the other person, and that's going to be Aharon to do it in your stead. That's asking Moshe to be a partner in his own diminishment, but the outcome of that is Moshe then somehow asserts or has a greatness over Aharon. The two notions of power and forbearance are classically associated in the Talmudic description of God. Wherever you find power, gvura of God, there you find God's humility, anvitanut. This principle is written in the Torah, in the prophets, and in the scriptures. That's a midrashic formulation, agadic formulation that appears sometimes where the Chachamim want to make a point that something is very, well demonstrated in biblical literature. They'll say you find it in the Torah, you find it in Nevi'im, and you find it in Ketuvim. So it's not limited to one of those places. Oh, hold on a second, folks. We might have a delay. Yeah. I'm going to pause. If I make it back, great. If not, I apologize for having to stop here.
So did anybody print out the sources? Because then somebody could read and we could make some ground while Rav Stephen is being a good parent.
So this is Jake. I can be a good parent also. I have a copy of the book.
Awesome. Okay.
So let me get that and I can continue. Actually, before I do, some years ago, I heard Rabbi Benjamin Blech speak at a shul here in Baltimore. And I don't remember what the exact topic of it was, but one thing he mentioned that stuck with me is that the Zohar states explicitly that Cain and Abel were reincarnated as Moshe and Aharon. So I don't actually know which one was which, but the fact that these two rival siblings have come back in a much better relationship. So maybe we'll see how that plays out to you. On 362. Okay. Okay, 362. Wherever you find power. Okay, wherever you find power, Gevura of God, there you find God's humility. This principle is written in the Torah and the prophets and in the scriptures. In the Torah, it is written, "For the Lord your God is the supreme God and the supreme Lord," which is followed by, "He does justice to the orphan and the widow." This is in Deuteronomy chapter 10. This is repeated in the prophets. "So says the exalted one, the sublime one who lives eternally," which is followed by, "Yet with the contrite and the lowly in spirit." This is from Isaiah chapter 57. And again in the scriptures, "Extol him who rides the clouds, the Lord is his name," which is followed by, "The father of orphans, champion of widows." This is Psalm 68. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, can I make a comment on what you said about Cain and Abel?
Sure.
It suddenly is fascinating me that if they're being compared to Cain and Abel, and you can think of Aaron as the one who's like Cain because his sacrifice was not accepted in terms of the golden calf. And then who's put in charge of all the sacrifices of all the holy connections with God? It's Aaron. So that's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like he's given an opportunity to do tshuva through his service.
It's what do you call it? A tikkun for what happened at the beginning of the Torah. It's a correction. So, yeah. Oh, I don't know how I can. I saw it. Gallery. Oh,
there he is.
We'll give this one more try, see if it holds. If not, then I'll sign off with apologies.
Stephen, I just read to the end of that paragraph.
Great.
And before I did, I mentioned that Rabbi Blech, Benjamin Blech, once spoke here in Baltimore, and one of the things he said was from the Zohar that Cain and Abel were reincarnated, and they were reincarnated as Moshe and Aharon. Oh, I just interjected that just as something to keep in mind.
Wow, amazing! Thank you. Okay, great. So we have this threefold demonstration of the idea that where God's might is found, so is God's humility found. The Talmud traces biblical passages where God's power is juxtaposed to God's forbearance. More accurately, invitanut emerges as God's association with the depressed members of society, the widow, the orphan, the demoralized, right? We sometimes think about when the text talks about, the Midrashic text talks about God's power juxtaposed to God's humility. Well, humility could be a lot of different things. Here, humility indicates placing oneself with the vulnerable members of society. So where you find God's might, it's associated with God's making God's self available, or allying God's self with the vulnerable members of society. This divine proclivity informs the demand God makes of Moshe in our Midrash. Essentially, in requiring a humility that is another face of greatness, God looks to Moshe for a genetic marker of the Tselem Elohim, the image of God, the godlike play of the lion and the lamb in one face. So this, the mighty and the lowly, or in one face. The humility or forbearance that Moshe is to express in appointing Aharon to his own role is at base a matter of relationship. As God displays a magnanimous imagination in nurturing the less impressive members of society, so is Moshe to realize in himself and empathy for those who are stripped of power. It is loss, divestment of the priestly robes, that is to open up for him an alternative sensibility. So somehow in stripping of himself this power and giving it to Aaron, he has both this might and this humility at the same time. And this is something which we see as a godly characteristic. I like this language, a humility that is another face of greatness, right? When the Midrash says you find them in the same location, Dr. Zornberg is sort of playing on it to say, in some sense, they're almost two sides of the same coin. They're two faces of the same thing. In this process, language plays a powerful, if enigmatic role. Never surprising to hear her say that. Aaron, not Moshe, is the speaker, the man of words. Aharon, not Moshe, will be high priest. On the face of it, the priestly function does not require much eloquence. It does, however, require the wearing of robes, of a priestly costume. We have the pasuk and its commentary. You should wind turbans upon them and gird both Aaron and his sons with sashes, and so they shall have priesthood as their right for all time. The commentary, Midrash Halacha explains, if one serves as a priest without the full priestly raiment, one's service is disqualified. At the time their raiment, their garment is upon them, their priesthood is upon them. If their raiment is not upon them, their priesthood is not upon them, right? It's this and so this sort of causal relationship in this verse. Right? It's in putting their clothes on them that they will have the priesthood. But when they're not wearing those clothes, they don't have the priesthood. The clothing makes the priest. Not to be attired in exactly the right clothes is sufficient to disqualify the priest from the ritual. This uncompromising association of the priest with his raiment invites exploration. To be a priest is to be born to the function and to wear the clothes of a priest, right? She's already starting to point out these sort of two dimensions. There's a hereditary identity dimension to the priesthood, and there is a, depending on actually wearing the garments of the role dimension of the priesthood. What, in fact, is the definition of the word Kohen, priest? Rashi indicates an unexpected ambiguity in the concept. Commenting on 28:3, where the word Kohen is used as a verb, you shall make Aaron the priestly raiment to sanctify, and lekadesho, lechahano li, to make him a Kohen to me, but almost to cause him to do Kohanic activities to me, lechahano li. Rashi writes, to sanctify him, to initiate him into the priesthood through his raiment, so that he may be a Kohen to me. The expression Kohen means to serve. So she further explains, Kohen indicates one who serves. It is a function within a system, a verb, rather than a noun. When, for instance, the text refers to Aaron's son, who is Kohen in his place, this should be translated, who serves in his place. The function can be fulfilled only in the proper robes. So that's the verb side, where it's not an intrinsic identity, but it's dependent on enacting the service. That's one Rashi. On the other hand, Rashi comments on 19:6. This is going back to Parashat Yitro, Vatem tihiyu li mamlechet kohanim. You should be unto me a kingdom of priests, princes. This is Rashi's comment, princes, as we find, and the sons of David were kohanim. And she explains, clearly the Davidic line could not have been priests. Rashi resolves this problem by translating Kohen as prince. On Rashi's second translation, Kohen is not a role, a function of service, but a status, a noun, an indication of power. Between Rashi's two translations runs an axis similar to the one we have noticed between the terms greatness and forbearance. Okay, so this is her sort of first connection that she's making, right? In a way, as far as we might imagine her from the kind of rigidly structured method of analysis that we call, the Brisker Derech, which is all about creating these sort of chilukim, these distinctions between two dimensions of a thing or two possible explanations or analyses of a thing, and noticing that sometimes, one dimension is manifest and sometimes the other. As much as I would never describe Aviva Zornberg as a brisker, but she does this thing too. She points out an ambiguity, she points out a tension, she points out two aspects of a thing, and then sometimes sort of traces consequences or analogies to that split as they show up in other places. And so that's what she's going to do here. We saw the idea that two faces of the same thing that are combined in God's identity, and that Moshe is being called upon to do in that midrash that I read to you at the beginning, are this, diminishing of the self, the forbearance, and then the greatness. And here she's suggesting in some way that these two definitions of Kohen, the intrinsic identity and the role verb of service are aligned in a similar type of way. Kohen, the noun, is the sort of greatness one. Kohen, the verb, service, is a kind of subjugating of the self, a forbearance, a yielding, a humility in a different kind of way. Between Rashi's, okay, good. The virtues of the lion and the lamb are linked to one another in a necessary tension. To be a Kohen is both to act out a role of service, to submit to a superior force, and to be an aristocrat, aware of power in oneself. I think we're not going to continue on this year to Vayikra with Dr. Zornberg, but because Vayikra is so much about the Kohanim, we have this little insight. And I think for me, this is one of the core messages or takeaways from her essay here. It's just this way of thinking about the Kuhuna as both a forbearance service dimension and a status, aristocracy, power, greatness dimension. The tension between Rashi's two translations represents, I suggest, a real complexity in the meaning of priesthood. To wear the regalia of the Kohen is to express an innate grandeur on the one hand, and to fit oneself out for work on the other. These two poles are only apparently in opposition, however. For the prince in all his essential splendor functions within a hierarchy of power, while the service role reflects some of the majesty of the power who is served. At the same time, the range of possible points of balance between the two poles remains undetermined, and the axis between them remains a site of tension. Right? So she wants to point out here that, again, like I think the Midrash is trying to argue about God's greatness and humility, that it's not really opposites, but they sort of interplay with each other and inform each other. So the service manifests some of the power, and somehow vice versa, but still, I can't express it better than she does. Where that balance lines up, is the Kohen more power or more service, is not defined, and so there still is tension between them, even though they interplay with one another. A similar tension is described by the Ramban in his comment on the purpose of the priestly raiment. The Torah affirms that the raiment is lechavod or letifaret, for glory and beauty. And Ramban writes, he should be dignified and glorious in dignified, glorious garments, as the text says, like a bridegroom adorned with glory. Pasuk from Yeshayahu. For these garments are royal raiment. Kings were clothed in such garments at the time of the Torah. The clothes should be made for Aharon to serve in them for the glory of God who dwells among them, and for the beauty of their strength. For you are the beauty of their strength. It is also written, the house of our holiness and our beauty, where our fathers praised you. Holiness refers to God's glory, and beauty to the beauty of Israel. And the clothes must be fashioned with full intentionality, awareness of their sacred purpose, and possibly even require kavanah, awareness of the complex meanings expressed in them. That is why God said, you should speak to all who are wise in heart, whom I have filled with the spirit of wisdom, that they should understand what they are making. Okay, so that's the Ramban. She'll explain a little bit. The purpose of the clothes is for glory and beauty. They represent the grandeur of God, in serving whom the priest too becomes glorious. They constitute a language of prestige and power. Ramban emphasizes the aesthetic, representational function of the priest's vestments in all their majesty and humility. The high priest is arrayed like God's ministering angels, expressive of total attention, of a being so irradiated with an awareness of God that even its vestments dazzle. If the vestments are to have this authentically expressive power, inside and outside must match. Therefore, Ramban emphasizes the consciousness and intentionality even of the craftsmen who fashion them. One more little section. Here we approach the problematic heart of the issue. The position of the high priest as representing God's glory is reflected in the aesthetics of his regalia. In a sense, the body and the soul of the man within the clothes become irrelevant. His appearance is all important. The ecstatic intensity with which the high priest was seen at the most exalted moment of his service is described in lyrical verses recited on Yom Kippur, the Mareh Kohen, which we now sing so joyfully. Triumphant with joy, he emerges from the Holy of Holies, the only human being ever to experience that space, which is ordeal and intimacy. He has achieved atonement for himself and for all his people. We have some excerpts of that liturgical poem. Like a tent stretched over the supreme beings was the appearance of the priest. Like thunderbolts issuing from the brilliance of the angels was the appearance of the priest, Mareh Kohen. Like the image of the rainbow in the cloud, like a rose in a pleasure garden, like a garland set on the king's brow, like the glow on the bridegroom's face, like the purity of a pure diadem was the appearance of the priest. I'm just zipping through because I'm going to pause in a moment and be right back. The changing conceits evoke the indescribable. In the priest's face is reflected an inner beauty that does not shame the purity of the priestly raiment. As the following refrain has it, happy was the eye that saw all these, but the hearing of the ear makes us sad. Since the destruction of the temple, we mourn the loss of that aesthetic moment. What survives is merely mashma oznenu, oral report, indirect hearing about what was once seen. The high priest then offered the people a visual intimation of the majesty and humility, right? Those are our 2 points, majesty and humility, of one who has come close to God. Beyond the personal contingencies of his human situation, he comes to represent the intersection of the human and the divine. Ideally, his vestments clothe and cover his body in such a way that he is transmuted into a vision of God's glory that registers no dissonance between inner and outer worlds. I'll be right back. Okay, great. Happy to pause here if anyone has questions, comments, reactions to this interplay of greatness and humility, whether on the divine plane, on the human plane as it pertains to the high priest and the notion of the kahuna. Happy to take any thoughts, comments. Steve, great. Go ahead and unmute. Love to hear from you.
Just a question or a comment about the phrase that the body and soul were irrelevant. The outward appearance was what was most important. But don't we know that, or didn't we learn that the high priest was someone who was supposed to have no defects, no physical defects or deformities?
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, the body would be important.
Excellent. That's a great comment, a great point. And I don't have a ready answer for it. I think just go back to that spot. Yeah, I'm not sure what she would say. You're absolutely right that we do have this significant idea about the priest of a kind of a physical perfection that is important. So I don't know, maybe it does, the line that you read, in a sense, the body and the soul of the man within the clothes becomes irrelevant. His appearance is all important. I guess it's saying how he's seen to people and not even almost what he actually is. So I don't know how physical imperfections plays into that. It seems almost like at the first level it matters, but somehow, when people perceive, or at some further level, that concern kind of slips away. But I'm not totally sure. I think it's a really good point. It's something I've always sort of wrestled with, is that question of, why should the priest need this sort of sense of physical perfection, or not having, whatever the Bible considered to be blemishes. So it's I think an important issue in its own right. And yeah, I think it raises some challenge to what she's saying here. So thank you.
Thank you.
Great, let's go on a little more. Okay, so now we're jumping to our next section, and I'll start sharing my screen again, bottom of page 375. Moses the dresser. In the relation between Moshe and Aaron, clearly it is Aaron who wears the vestments, the given forms of a hereditary role. Moshe's role is less defined, but significantly he has the task of dressing Aaron as he is initiated into his priestly role. In this task, then, he imitates God, who dresses the first couple, that being Adam and Chava, right, back in the Garden of Eden. And now we have, he's imitating God in now being instructed, dress Aharon and his sons in these garments, anoint them and ordain them, and consecrate them to serve me as priests. It is Moshe who invests Aharon into his priesthood. In our original Midrash, it was the wife who was to select a new wife for her husband. This describes the fraught moment when Moshe clothes Aharon in priesthood. Moshe is thus the dresser of others, while clothing seems entirely irrelevant to himself. The only reference to Moshe's clothing is to the shoes he removes at the burning bush. And this is just like a wonderful insight. It's the kind of thing you could also imagine Rav Meidan, noting or pointing out. Of course, in the footnote 45, I can actually zip to that spot here. She says, see, however, the mysterious reference to a mask or veil that Moshe assumes and removes, dons and doffs, after the golden calf episode. For discussion of this passage, see chapter 9. So she acknowledges that, that potentially other moment, but short of that, it is noteworthy that we just don't know. I mean, there are some biblical characters that we never hear anything about their clothes. There are some biblical characters that we hear more about their clothes, and Aaron's clothes in serving as the Kohen Gadol, it's very significant, and it's a stark contrast to Moshe's clothes, about which we really never hear anything. So he is thus the dresser of others, while clothing seems entirely irrelevant to himself. In dressing Aaron, however, Moshe serves in a not merely pragmatic fashion. This becomes hauntingly evident in God's commanding Moshe to take Aaron up the mountain to his death, and strip Aaron of his vestments and put them on Elazar, his son. Then Aaron will be gathered in and die there. This is from later on in Bamidbar. This deathbed doffing and donning of priestly robes signifies Aaron's shedding the husk of his role, which is identical with his life, right? So even though on the one hand, we talked about the clothing as sort of external and exterior, on the other hand, for Aaron, the high priest, they also, insofar as they are supposed to kind of reflect someone who's inside and outside are consistent, reaches a point where his clothes become him in some way. And so in disrobing from his clothes, he is divested of his life. In this process of divestment, Moshe is the essential agent. In effect, this act of stripping Aharon and dressing his son is the sole purpose of Moshe's presence on the mountain. And the word lahafshit, to strip, is of course the same word as the Midrash uses of the serpent when it sloughs its skin. I think this was in a Midrashic section that was not in one of the parts that we read. That is a radical ambiguity about skin and clothing. Personhood and role is intimated here, right? How are they separable? How are they interrelated? Is one's clothing one's selfhood? What is Moshe's place in this terminal scene? Rashi offers a poignant midrashic reading. His clothing, this is again on the instructions that God is giving Moshe to divest Aaron of his clothing. His clothing, this refers to the high priest's vestments in which Moshe had clothed him. He now divested them to put them on his son in his presence. And now Rashi is dramatizing the moment for us. Moshe said to Aaron, enter the cave, and he entered. He saw a bed spread and a candle lit. Moshe said, ascend into the bed, and he ascended. Spread your hands, and he spread them. Close your mouth, and he closed it. Close your eyes, and he closed them. At that moment, Moshe coveted the death of Aaron. That is why God later told him, you shall die on the mountain you are about to ascend, as your brother Aaron died. The death that you desired. The plain sense of the text is that God is telling him, just like Aaron died up on a mountain, you're going to die up on a mountain. But the Midrash is interpreting it, you're going to die the way Aaron died. That whatever experience of intimacy, she's going to, explicate it a little bit more, that Aaron experienced that you wished you would have, you're going to have. Moshe's role is one of guidance to his brother in his death passage. Stage by stage, he moves him through the choreography of a model death. He also offers Aaron the last consolation of seeing his son inherit his greatness, literally invested in his garments. At the same time, however, the Midrash obliquely comments on Moshe's own experience. The implicit contrast between the brothers is spelled out in Rashi's earlier comment. Take Aaron, your brother, an earlier phrase. Take him with words of consolation. This is a classic Midrashic point where when the text says to take a person, the Chachamim often comment, how you can't take a person, you can't physically take a person, so it means drawing them with words. So take Aaron, your brother, doesn't literally mean grab him. It means take him with words, here words of consolation. And what are you saying? What is Moshe to say to Aaron? Happy are you that you see your crown passed on to your son, which I shall not merit. Moshe defines for Aaron the privilege of his situation. What you have, I do not have. What Aaron has is the serenity of a role that can be transferred to his children, of meanings that can be conveyed through time and space. His personal death can be accepted with an extraordinary equanimity because he possesses a vocabulary that can be transmitted. Aaron is not alone in his death. He can be helped by Moses to experience his own virtual survival in his son. Moshe, on the other hand, covets that death, for it is alien and fascinating to his spirit. If he is not high priest, that is because forms and formulas, ceremonies and rituals, the treacheries and seductions of language were always inimical to him. Therefore, he has no heirs of his spirit, and he dies alone. As the Pasuk says at the end of the Torah, and Moshe, servant of God, died there, and he buried him in the valley. Vayikbol oto bagai. Who buried him? God in God's glory. And Rabbi Yishmael says he buried himself. The uncanny image of Moshe burying himself is not radically different from that of God burying him. These are, I suggest, two modes of expressing the same notion, that Moshe's death is unique, unmediated by any ceremonies of clothing, unattended by the kindness of human language. Strangely, Rashi implies in his passage on Aharon's death that God does not grant Moshe the death he envied in Aharon. This is difficult to integrate into Rashi's own reading of Moshe's death, alone with God. Perhaps Rashi implies that the real desire of Moshe is for a death accomplished in serenity like Aharon's, and that desire is met in the quite different tonality of Moshe's death. I think I should actually pause here. So a lot here. Sorry, I don't have a chance to unpack it more with you. But in the first half, we saw this idea of the, two dimensions, two sides of greatness and humility, how that plays out in the Kohen, and the tension between role, identity, status of power, and the idea of service and humility that goes along with it. And then again, there was much more to bridge those in the intervening 10 pages or so. But then in the second half, again, the interplay of Moshe and Aharon with garments and rules and language, and this pairing of all of those things with his identity, and how that plays out in his death. And Moshe somehow, in contrast, as a person who at the same time enables Aaron to go through that process, and yet is so profoundly different and outside of all of those things. I mean, this description, which I think is just such a deep insight into Moshe's personality or personhood. If he is not high priest, that is because forms and formulas, ceremonies and rituals, the treacheries and seductions of language were always inimical to him. Just such a different person, a different personality between Moshe and Aaron, their leadership styles and their lived experiences, and the different ways that connects them to God and to other people. I'll pause for any last questions or comments before we wrap up. This one I think is a little more all over the place. Interestingly, much less psychoanalysis and literature, much more Rashi, Midrash, and her reading of it. So happy to hear any thoughts before we close. Lance, go ahead.
What fascinates me is that Moshe and Aaron die in the wilderness, the magical wilderness. But if you think about it, Enoch and Elijah don't die. They go straight to heaven, and Enoch becomes Metatron, and Elijah becomes Sandalphon, angels. And it just seems strange that the two major characters in Judaism really are Moses and Aaron, when the two characters in Judaism that seem to transcend the problems of earth and go straight to heaven are Enoch and Elijah. The other thing that I thought, which is not really related, is the question of water. Where's water in all this? If you look behind me, you will see the place where, the Makom, where many scholars, many archaeologists and so forth argue that the true temple existed, the temple of both Solomon and of the second temple. And why? Because of the Gihon spring, which is water. In other words,
right,
according to them, you cannot have a priestly organization, a priestly business without water. Where's the water in the Temple Mount? Where's the water in the Torah right now? Where's the water in this essay? I don't see it.
Two fascinating insights. The angels versus men. The figures you mentioned really are, they're all mystical, powerful characters, but yes, there's something much more otherworldly about the other two than about Moshe and Aaron. Even Moshe, who's described as a man of God, still the character that we experience of him is much less mystical, I think. And a great question about water. I don't have an answer, but I love the noticing. Thank you. Dad, go ahead.
So I find it sad that Aaron gets to see his son Elazar wearing his vestments as the high priest, and Moshe consoles him with this event, and Moshe will never experience anything like that. What I find sad is that Aaron also experienced the death of his first two sons. And I'm just wondering if in the back of Aaron's mind, he thought maybe the other sons will die. Maybe there won't be any sons to follow after me.
Hmm.
And here it's Moshe who has to tell him that here your son is following you as the high priest.
Well, very, very profound. And I think the kind of thing I could imagine Viva Zornberg saying, right? That what's some kind of underlying fear that Aaron carries around is two sons were taken from him and almost in the line of duty, doing what they thought they might be supposed to be doing in service, and they just were snatched away so suddenly and sharply. And so how does he have any confidence about the continuity of his priesthood? And somehow that emphasizes the importance of Moshe giving him God and Moshe giving him this gift. And I think, I often quote you as saying that, in the Friday night blessing, we give our sons, in this case, we choose Ephraim and Manasseh, and we never, and elsewhere the Midrash talks about when it says in God's promises to Avraham, Hayeh bracha, in the beginning of Lech Lecha, you'll be a blessing. Rashi comments, people charge their children that they should be like Avraham, but we never say to our kids, be like Moshe, because it's just such a unattainable, different kind of character. And so that kind of almost the disconnect with his children, I think, just highlights the singularity and uniqueness of him. And there is a tragic dimension to it from our lens. And he's just so singular. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for indulging some side parenting and wishing everybody a great night. Looking forward to next week. Hold on. Let me check the calendar. When is Purim coming up? That's not for... no, next Monday night we will not meet for Purim. So looking forward. I'll figure out whether we're going to reschedule that or miss it, and get back to you on the schedule update by email. Thanks, everybody. Love to mom and dad, and to all. Good night.